Welcome, wrestling fans, to the Pro Wrestle Machine. Let's jump right into it. From the Wrestling Observer newsletter, May 3rd and 10th, 1999. The death of Rick Rude on April 20th becomes the latest addition to a strange and macabre body count that is very close to becoming synonymous with the pro wrestling industry. Rude passed away that evening of a heart attack after being rushed to the North Fulton Medical Center near his home in Alpharetta, Georgia, an Atlanta suburb, at the age of 40. Rude, who was working with WCW as an announcer for the Backstage Blast PPV airings of Nitro on DirecTV once per month after being removed from his role as childhood friend Curt Hennig's on-camera manager, had been training for an in-ring comeback after his career presumably had ended after suffering a broken back in a May 1, 1994 match against Sting at the Fukuoka Dome. Rude's death becomes the 25th known death of an active young pro wrestling personality over the past 6 years and the 6th death of someone actively participating in the business so far in 1999. Rude, whose legal name was Richard Irwin Rude, had a friendship with Hennig that dated back to childhood. His father Dick and Kurt's father Larry, a famous pro wrestler of a generation ago, are also longtime friends. Rude and Hennig attended Robbinsdale High School near Minneapolis together. That afternoon Rude had taken his 8-year-old son to school, attended a martial arts class and went out to hit some golf balls. About 5 p.m. his wife returned from shopping and found him on the floor barely breathing and with a light pulse. She called 911, and he was revived briefly in the ambulance before going into a coma and suffering cardiac arrest in the hospital. The heart attack is being investigated as a possible drug overdose. There were empty prescription pill bottles found near his bed. The Fulton County Medical Examiner's Office reported on April 22 that the autopsy could not pinpoint a cause of death, and it is officially being labeled as pending upon completion of toxicology tests, which could take several weeks or even months. Nobody seemingly saw this particular incident coming, although incidents like this are no longer unexpected. Due to a wrestling public that has been numbed with the frequency of out-of-the-ring incidents that at one time in this sport and even today in any other sport would have been considered alarming, are now considered regular weekly occurrences, a wrestling star, even one of the biggest names from a past era, dying at a young age is no longer surprising or shocking to the wrestling public at large. The big picture, in many cases the 3 children and a wife left behind, which is another pattern in many of these deaths, will be forgotten as people attempt to circumvent what they fear may be the bigger truth and hide from bad publicity, because this may be another case of being too much of a regular pattern. Rude had been attempting to get out of his WCW contract since at least December, presumably to wrestle in the WWF. At one point he threatened Eric Bischoff that he'd just show up in the stands on a WWF television broadcast, not realizing his contract prohibited that, and that due to all the legal problems between the two companies the WWF wouldn't have allowed it either without a release from WCW. There had been bad blood over Bischoff signing Rude from WWF for $300,000 per year on a 3-year deal in a notable coup in late 1997, with Rude appearing, sans beard, on Nitro earlier in the evening, with him appearing later that evening with a beard on a taped Raw 6 days earlier, but, like so many others, never pushing him, although realistically it's hard to fault Bischoff on this score, as he did try to groom him for a heel announcer role which turned out not to be his forte. Rude had told friends that he was going to confront Kevin Nash, claiming Nash had also promised him a larger announcing role. Before signing with WCW, Rude had been working WWF without a contract and had been negotiating with Bischoff for weeks for the right time to perform the jump. Rude was brought in originally to be a heel NWO television announcer, based on his work in ECW. However, once given the shot, it was something he was clearly not cut out for. His ECW work, while initially funny, ran out of steam by the 2nd or 3rd week, and Paul Heyman kept him in the role just long enough to create an angle to turn him heel and get him out. The bad blood was such that at Rude's viewing on April 23, Rude's mother asked Bischoff, who came with his wife, when he showed up, to leave, which Bischoff quietly did. There has been acknowledgement from friends of Rude and others that at about the time he started trying to get out of his WCW deal, that he made contact with the WWF and tried to set up a comeback, pitching them on the idea of a run against Steve Austin. The two were friends and sometimes tag team partners in the early 90s when they were in WCW together as members of the Dangerous Alliance. The holdup, besides being under contract to WCW, was that he had received a 7-figure settlement from Lloyd's of London claiming his 1994 broken back had ended his career as an active wrestler. The settlement, combined with a lawsuit against WCW for what he claimed was his career-ending injury, that wasn't settled until the new deal was made, was the reason that when Rude had worked as a manager/bodyguard/insurance policy role in ECW, WCW and the WWF over the past 2 years, that whenever he was involved in anything physical, It was very limited. He could be on a fence, but because of his agreements, was not allowed to be put in a position where he would have to take a bump since he claimed the back injury prevented him from doing that part of the pro wrestling job description. Rude had attempted to get WCW and had talked with WWF, although the talking never got past the preliminary stages of paying off Lloyd's of London on his permanent disability claim, which would allow him to return as an active wrestler. Lloyd's of London, which no longer will insure pro wrestlers, paid off similar claims to Hennig and Joe Laurinaitis, Road Warrior Animal, who both, after taking several years off and collecting on a large disability payment, ended up returning to the ring. Laurinaitis' deal ended up where he claimed he would be able to function as a tag team wrestler, but not as a singles wrestler, which is why he hasn't been booked in any singles matches in the WWF, and the WWF has never been able to go anywhere with a Hawk vs. Animal feud, which would seem to have been about the only thing left for the team at one point. Probably now it's too late for people to even care about that. According to friends, Rude had been training intensely for a comeback even though no such deal was specifically on the table. He was in the process of building a new home on 20 acres in Rome, Georgia, and talked of opening a pro wrestling camp on the property. He had just purchased a new truck. He was about 255 pounds and looking almost as muscular as ever, at a considerably higher body weight than during most of his career up until a recent bout with pneumonia caused him to drop nearly 40 pounds. At the time of his death he had gained some of the weight back and was in excess of 235 pounds. During his career his weight generally varied from as low as 205 off steroids to about 235. He was a great entertainer, said his wife Michelle, 33. He was nothing like the person in the ring. He was a great family man. He lived for his kids, and he ate and slept wrestling. With no cause of death, the speculation has run rampant. There had been a series of incidents going back 2 months. On March 1st, when Rude was brought to Chapel Hill, North Carolina to do the backstage blast, he literally passed out on the set in between on-air segments, and his performance was said to have been embarrassing to the point it was debated between segments about even allowing him to continue on camera. His next assignment, the April 5th backstage blast in Las Vegas, he missed due to the pneumonia. 4 days later near his home he was arrested on a DUI. Within wrestling, much of the talk links it to gamma-hydroxybutyrate, commonly known as GHB, a drug also known as ecstasy, which from several sources is considered epidemic within the company and many claim throughout pro wrestling. There have been many behind-the-scenes incidents involving pro wrestling personalities over the past 2 months that are commonly traced to abuse of GHB, including one near-death experience in a dressing room and an incident that is believed traced to the drug that cost a former WWF performer his job. The drug was very popular in pro wrestling and nightclubs in the early 90s before it was taken off the market due to the incidences of problems. A new form is more readily available, and is popular among bodybuilders and strippers because it induces quick and deep sleep, and allegedly increases the secretion of growth hormone while sleeping, and thus leads to burning more calories while sleeping and thus cutting body fat, considered particularly beneficial to women who have a hard time fighting nature when it comes to maintaining youthful legs. Because of how GHB breaks down in the body, if this was the case, it probably will never show up in a coroner's report. Nor as noted in the ESPN Outside the Lines segment, would human growth hormone. The natural speculation, given his physique, would also gravitate towards speculation about steroids, which frequently elevate blood pressure and in extreme cases can lead to heart attacks. There is no indication Rude ever used HGH. Rude's steroid use was well documented. Richard Rude was born December 7, 1958 and grew up in Robbinsdale, Minnesota. After high school, he was working as a bouncer at Grandma B's, considered the toughest bar in the northeastern section of Minneapolis along with Laurinaitis, Michael Hegstrand, Road Warrior Hawk, and Barry Darsow. He was considered to be the toughest of the 4, even though he was the lightest, and was noted for being so powerful he often was able to knock people out with an open-handed slap. Years later, while in pro wrestling, he knocked out 400-pound Samoan Paul Noy, who wrestled as PN News, and who currently works in Austria as Cannonball Grizzly, while the two had a problem with one open-handed slap. Although very muscular and known in particular for having perhaps the best abs of any wrestler in modern wrestling, which he credited to having great genetics, and deceptively tall at 6'4", because of his relatively thin legs and long thin torso, he had the look of being in great condition, but not necessarily of great power. But obviously those looks were deceiving as he had incredible grip strength, said to be similar to Danny Hodge, and was well known as a tough street fighter. He was a noted arm wrestler, finishing 6th in the World Championships held in Las Vegas in the light heavyweight division in 1983 after placing 2nd in the U.S. Nationals in 1980. You can talk about this and that guy being a great shooter, noted Eddie Sharkey, who trained Rude, Arso, the Road Warriors, Nikita Koloff and numerous others for pro wrestling. But this guy kicked more ass than any of them. People didn't realize how tough this guy was. Nobody could come close to him. He'd slap guys with an open hand and it looked like their head exploded. Sharkey also noted that Rude was so strong at arm wrestling that he was able to put down Hawk, who was a much larger man at the time, even allowing Hawk to use both his arms against one of his. Growing up in Minneapolis in the early 80s, where wrestling was part of the local culture with the likes of the Crusher, Vern Gagne, Baron von Raschke, Bobby Heenan, Mad Dog Vachon, Nick Bockwinkel, Jesse Ventura and later peaking with Hulk Hogan, it was more natural for young tough gym rats and bouncers to think about pro wrestling more than other parts of the country. In 1981, Rude was training for a Tough Man contest under Ray Webb Jr., a local figure and promoter who had ties to both the city's boxing and pro wrestling community. He had a 2-0 record as an amateur boxer training under Papa Joe Dasuix, a noted local boxing figure. Some say he could have made a lot of money as a boxer. But he and the others all gravitated toward pro wrestling and made a lot more. He had no money at the time, so he got friends to loan him the money to pay for his training under Sharkey. He broke into wrestling and often barely had enough money for gas to get to his matches and would sleep in his car. When he became a money player in pro wrestling, he paid everyone back. Years later, when Sharkey was down on his luck after serving a term in prison and was working as a referee for the WWF, and Ravishing Rick Rude was by then a headliner, he showed up at a cart in Minneapolis and gave Sharkey a bag filled with $3,000 in cash. Rude and Hegstrand were being trained by Sharkey to be a tag team when Sharkey invited Ole Anderson, who was running Georgia Championship Wrestling Incorporated, which had the best national television exposure in the country on WTBS about a year before Vince McMahon took the WWF National up to his camp to look at his huge, by the standards of the time, students. Anderson had just seen the movie Road Warrior a week or two earlier and wanted a huge bodybuilder to play the role in late 1982, and picked Laurinaitis for the role. Rude, Hegstrand and Laurinaitis all started wrestling at that time, and all paying their dues, getting no push and making no money in different parts of the country, but almost immediately. Sharkey urged them to stick it out. A few months later, Anderson, who was grooming a young tag team of Arnold Anderson and Matt Bourne to be his top heel combination, saw Bourne get arrested on a sexual assault charge and have to leave the territory. Ole needed a team in a hurry and Sharkey recommended Rude and Hegstrand. He flew back to Minneapolis, picked Hegstrand and Laurinaitis, using the Road Warriors gimmick, and Bill Watts later came up with the idea for the face paint, and the two were immediate sensations. A few weeks later, Anderson, starving for new talent as business was in a weak period due to the promotion being screwed up, a disease that would plague Atlanta-based wrestling offices more often than not over the next 16 years, brought Rude and Darsow in. Rude was given a minor push at the beginning, miscast because of his looks, not recognizing he had a certain attitude that made him a natural heel, as a babyface with a gimmick, creatively enough, as the toughest bouncer in Minneapolis, who was a former arm wrestling champion, to feud with then national heavyweight champion Larry Zbyszko. He didn't last long in Georgia and was sent to work briefly for Jim Crockett in the Carolinas as jobber Ricky Rude, sounding more like a race car driver, and later Watts in the Mid-South Territory as a good-looking undercard babyface. Watts had nothing for him either, but it was Jerry Jarrett who made him a star. In early 1984, Watts was bringing Bill Dundee in as booker and he brought in the likes of the Rock and Roll Express, Bobby Eaton and Dennis Condrey, who formed a tag team called the Midnight Express, taken from an Alabama tag team trio of Condrey and Norvell Austin and Randy Rose, who had first used the Midnight Express name a few years earlier. Terry Taylor and Jim Cornette among others from Memphis that were basically second-teamers in Memphis that Dundee and Watts saw a lot of potential in, although they succeeded probably beyond either's expectations as it led to the hottest run that territory would ever have. Watts sent Jarrett a few wrestlers that he had no more use for in exchange since he was adding so much new talent, Rude, King Kong Bundy and Jim Neidhart being the most notable. With only about 1 year full-time in the business and never having been given a serious push, Jarrett changed his name to Ravishing Rick Rude, gave him the popular song Smooth Operator as his ring music, which followed him around until his WWF days, and he was given a monstrous heel push with Valet Angel, playing the role he continued to play throughout his active career. At the time Rude wasn't particularly good in the ring, although since most of his main events were against Lawler, who at the time was one of the experts in the business at carrying guys, there was no problem in him headlining, although against the less talented Austin Idol, his weaknesses were somewhat apparent. His interviews weren't polished either, although the potential was there in that he had a great delivery, Almost the caliber of Jesse Ventura, although he didn't have Ventura's gift of coming up with creative interviews. His strong delivery and arrogant personality made people believe he truly hated opponents like Jerry Lawler, Austin Idol, Randy Savage and the Fabulous Ones and hate him for it. He even in his first territory as a headliner generated unusually great heat. He had a few traits that couldn't be taught that made him one of the great heels of his time that were evident almost from the start in Memphis, and really looking back to his start in Atlanta, although Jarrett was the first to pick up on them. He had movie star looks. He had a unique chiseled physique. He was a tall, very tough man, and he knew it. He had the confidence and the arrogance to go along with it, and he became a natural in displaying those qualities in front of the camera. Rude had memorable programs during a period when Jarrett's business was extremely strong, working as the main heel in the company for several months, managed by Jimmy Hart and frequently teaming with Bundy. Somewhere along the way, Angel disappeared, never to be seen again. But Rude was made as a star. He went next to Florida, under Dory Funk as booker. Rude had a good look, but in a territory based more on in-ring performance, he was usually paired as a tag team with Jesse Barr, a worker Funk really liked and thought was going to be a future superstar, as almost a Florida version of Jesse Ventura and Adrian Adonis, pairing the colorful guy with a great physique with a more ordinary-looking guy who was a great worker to handle the bulk of the in-ring work. Still, Rude was put on top as Southern Heavyweight Champion, with his most notable feud being with Wahoo McDaniel. Apparently at some point during that run, there was a dispute between the two of them. McDaniel, while past 45 at the time, was a legendary tough guy in both football a decade earlier and since then in wrestling. Apparently knowing Rude's reputation, apparently backed down in the confrontation, something he wasn't prone to do. Inside of wrestling as the word spread, people who didn't know of Rude as anything more than one of a million guys who worked on top in Memphis against Lawler recognized he must be one dangerous man. He met his future wife, who he married 3 years later, while working out of Tampa. His next stop was Texas starting in late 1985, for World Class Championship Wrestling where, as a trivia note, he became the first ever WCWA World Heavyweight Champion. He was American Heavyweight Champion at the time Jim Crockett made it very difficult for other promotions to book Ric Flair, at the time the NWA Champion, because he was planning on touring nationally using Flair as his top star and needed him for new markets. In response, Fritz von Erich, who headed the Dallas office, decided to withdraw from the NWA and in doing so, elevated the American title, which Rude held, to a world title. Rude headlined against all the Von Erichs along with the likes of Bruiser Brody and Chris Adams during his run in that area, which lasted until late 1986. On the biggest show to that point in his career, he worked the semi-main event on the May 4, 1986 show in Texas Stadium that drew 24,121 fans, paying $193,108 in defending the WCWA title, winning via DQ against Brody, which was the last true big money show in the history of that territory. During that year he was managed by not only a much slimmer Percy Pringle, Paul Bearer, but also had a red-haired female valet named Raven with a bodybuilder look, which it was never acknowledged at the time, was actually his sister. Next stop was Crockett's office, which at this point had gotten the TBS contract and thus was Vince McMahon's only real national competitor during the late 80s. Rude arrived in late 1986 and immediately was programmed as a mid-card heel feuding with old rival McDaniel. Eventually he was put together as a heel tag team with Manny Fernandez, who had just turned on Dusty Rhodes, and both were managed by Paul Jones. The two spent several months feuding with the Rock and Roll Express over the NWA World Tag Team titles, which Rude and Fernandez quickly won since the Express was better in the role of chasing the belts than holding them against a heel team that needed to make a reputation. In May of 1987, Rude, without giving notice or dropping the belts, which wasn't that unusual in days where wrestling contracts consisted of a handshake and the wrestling war was brutal, left JCP while holding one half of the tag team titles. Clumsily they announced on TBS that Rude had been injured and that Ivan Koloff was replacing him on the championship team. It got even weirder, because about a week later Fernandez walked out on the promotion as well. Eventually this was settled by JCP airing a tape of a match taped months earlier in Columbia, South Carolina, but announced on television that it had taken place on May 26, 1987 in Spokane, WA, a city JCP wasn't even running, where Rock and Roll Express had won what was at the time a non-title match taped for a Japanese World Pro Wrestling television show, and was labeled as the title change, a clumsy scenario since they aired Rude after just announcing he was badly injured and wouldn't be back. WWF was the land of the giants. Rude had a great physique. Most notable was his long torso, and with the body fat kept down, led his impressive abs, which Rude's pre-match dance highlighted. There was a knock on Rude at that time that his physique, because it wasn't thick bulky enough and because his in-ring talents weren't particularly great at the time, that he'd have a tough time getting past a certain level on a national promotion even though he made a very good regional top heel. A few things happened to change that. First, he got even more heavily into the steroids so size-wise he could match up to most of the main events. Still, because of his natural thin frame, even bulked up, he was never considered to have enough weight for a program with main man Hulk Hogan even though he was a stronger heel than the majority of the men Hogan was programmed with. He was packaged more as a stripper type, as the current character of Val Venus was based on being a modernized version of Rude. With the swivel hips and the pelvic thrust, he became a human catchphrase a decade before the business revolved around them. What I'd like to have right now, if for all you fat, out of shape, insert city sweathogs to take a lot at what a real man is supposed to look like, as he'd open his rope, heavily flexing his arms and abs, generally to thunderous boos. Although time has erased this from history, Rude was not an instant success in the WWF. He languished in undercards for several months until coming up with the catchphrase entrance and hitting it big with his first program, and perhaps his most memorable of all, with Jake Roberts, which started when he tried to hit on Roberts' wife Cheryl in an angle that was apparently years ahead of its time. Even though Roberts pinned Rude every night everywhere, Rude's arrogance was such that he continued to get great heat everywhere he went and got over stronger. The feud continued for most of 1988, eventually with Rude being managed by Bobby Heenan. Rude's arrogance in the ring was such that as great a heel as he was in territories, every attempt to turn him face fizzled. The irony is that during his active career, Rude was never a success anywhere as a face, although he was very successful just about everywhere as a heel. But if that same character would come along now, he'd be a huge face. Along with Roberts, his other big program of his WWF era was with the Ultimate Warrior. Rude scored one of the first and one of the exceedingly few pinfalls on Warrior in his WWF tenure when he won the Intercontinental title on April 2, 1989 at WrestleMania V in Atlantic City, leading to Warrior regaining the belt at the second annual SummerSlam on August 28, 1989 at the Meadowlands Arena as the second match from the top beneath Hogan. By this point, Rude had upped his work rate to where he became almost a bumping machine, which led to him being able to be one of the few who could get a good match out of Warrior. About the only others were Savage and Ted DiBiase, two of the best workers of the era. Of course, this also led to numerous injuries and ultimately, early retirement. After Warrior had captured the WWF title at WrestleMania V from Hulk Hogan at Toronto Skydome, Rude, who had largely feuded with Dusty Rhodes, was elevated to the top of the cards with the storyline being that he was the one who had beaten Warrior for the IC title, climaxing with Warrior winning a cage match in the main event at SummerSlam on August 27, 1990 in Philadelphia before a sellout 19,304 fans and drawing a 3.8 buy rate. As it turned out, this was the only PPV show that he headlined as a single. He headlined only one other PPV show, the May 17, 1992 WCW Wrestle War from Jacksonville, Florida in a War Games match as the Dangerous Alliance of himself, Arnold Anderson, Bobby Eaton, Austin and Zbyszko lost to Sting and Nikita Koloff and Dustin Rhodes and Ricky Steamboat and Barry Windham before 6,000 fans and drawing in 0.6 buy rate. His WWF career ended shortly after his SummerSlam main event after a dispute with McMahon. While out of action with a torn tricep, the WWF continued to advertise him for a house show run against Warrior in the main events. While business was disappointing during this period as Warrior was a weaker than expected draw as champion after Hogan, Rude was still the heel challenging for the title in all the advertising in the top arenas. Rude felt that his name was being used to draw the houses, however McMahon was paying him very little based on the fact he wasn't wrestling on those shows, and in those days before significant guaranteed money contracts, injured wrestlers were not well paid until they got back into action. He eventually quit the company over that dispute over not getting paid main event money on those shows. As was the case at that time, even after quitting, the WWF continued to advertise him as appearing on shows as a headliner for more than another month, including in some markets billing him as appearing on shows where the advertising hadn't even gone out until after he had quit. I can recall speaking with J.J. Dillon at this time about this problem, and his response was that the WWF felt that since Rude's contract hadn't expired and since the official release wasn't signed, that they had the right to advertise him to appear, even knowing full well that he had quit on the guise that, who knows, he may decide to come back and at that point it wouldn't be false advertising. Vince always treated my husband very well, said Michelle Rude. He goes by talent. Some other promoters didn't go by talent. Rick spoke what he felt. A lot of promoters didn't like that. Vince respected that and understood that. Others didn't and held it against him. Rude worked independence and All Japan, where Giant Baba wouldn't allow him to do his pre-match mic work or his stripper dance, and where his punch/kick offense and thin build didn't get him over past a mid-level foreigner, but fans did get into the personality he was allowed to show as an acceptable mid-carder, until his WWF contract expired. His style wasn't considered Japan-friendly, although he proved that wrong, as he did very well with New Japan on big shows over the next 2 years after he signed with WCW. After his WWF deal expired, on October 27, 1991, he debuted with WCW under a mask as a Halloween Phantom, using the Rude Awakening on Tom Zenk in 127, and got the mega push. 3 weeks later, on a televised Clash of the Champion, he captured the U.S. title from Sting due to outside interference from Lex Luger, beginning the last memorable feud of his active career, and one which left very bitter feelings since Rude blamed Sting for his career-ending injury nearly 3 years later. Without question, his career peaked in 1992, when he was the best heel in the entire business and one of its top workers, and headlined numerous house shows against Sting. But just as he really hit his stride as an all-around performer, injuries began breaking him down. Rude mainly feuded with Steamboat over the U.S. title in early 1992 in matches that were generally considered good but not great. What may have been the best match of his career was on August 12, 1992, at the finals of both the G1 and NWA World Heavyweight Title Tournament, losing to Masahiro Chono in 29:44 before a sellout 11,500 fans at Tokyo Sumo Hall. He is the only foreigner ever to go to the finals of a G1 tournament. Rude went through Super Strong Machine, Junji Hirata, Shinya Hashimoto and Kensuke Sasaki to reach the finals. As an aside, before his Sumo Hall match with Hashimoto, when he delivered his "Well, I'd like to have right now" speech with Medusa, who had made a name herself in Japan as a pro wrestler, as his valet, a crowd cheered wildly, knowing it was Rude's pre-match mic performance, but not knowing what he was actually saying, which was peppered with some racial slurs. By the time the finals came around 2 nights later, the word had gotten around as to what he was actually saying, and the crowd response had changed completely, to where he got every bit the heat the routine would get in the United States. Rude and Chono, ironically, followed that match of the year caliber performance at Sumo Hall into a worst match of the year winner at Halloween Havoc just 10 weeks later on October 25, 1992, where Chono lost via DQ to retain the title at the Philadelphia Civic Center. In between, Chono had been dropped on his head with a too-low version of a tombstone piledriver by Austin in a match in Yokohama, with the result being eerily similar to Austin later having the same thing happen to him from Owen Hart 5 years later. Chono was really never the same after that point, but wasn't close to being ready for the Philadelphia match. Rude and Sting were tearing houses down with classic U.S. title matches, with Rude being his bumping machine until being sidelined with 2 bulging discs, one of which pressed on a nerve, and Watts, in charge of WCW at the time, decided Rude had to vacate the title because he was going to be out of action for several weeks. Rude was somewhat upset at that, but more upset when Watts, with his old school values, cut Rude's pay since he wasn't going on the road in wrestling, which left Rude furious once again since he was injured in the ring. Rude eventually returned, but in the ring was never the same. By this point his reputation in wrestling was strong enough that it didn't really matter. He was scheduled to win the NWA World Heavyweight title finally from Ric Flair on September 19, 1993 in Houston, Texas, at the Fall Brawl PPV show. Interviews were taped, at the time when WCW would tape worldwide and do angles for months in advance, in Orlando that summer, with Rude holding the belt and talking about upcoming defenses, long before the Flair match was actually announced. The NWA Board of Governors, such as they were upset at WCW for making the title change without consulting with them first and voted to refuse to allow the change. This led to the final Quith NWA split. On television, after Rude beat Flair for the same physical belt that had been the NWA World title belt dating back to the mid-80s, it was announced as quickly and quietly as possible, while still fulfilling the directive of court rulings, that Rude was not the NWA champion. It was stated that WCW International, an organization separate from WCW, had created a world title, so this was referred to as the WCW International World title in the United States, and simply the WCW International Heavyweight title in Japan, when Rude lost and regained the title in 2 matches with Hiroshi before losing it to Sting on April 17, 1994 at the Spring Stampede PPV show in Chicago at the Rosemont Horizon. The final match of Rude's career as an active pro wrestler took place 2 weeks later, with his wife expecting the couple's second child, Marissa, who celebrated her 5th birthday 1 week after her father's death. They induced labor so he could be there for the birth. She was born the morning of April 27, 1994. He had to leave the country later that day for Japan, where he was scheduled to win back a world title. While wrestling Sting at the Fukuoka Dome before 53,500 fans on a show headlined by Antonio Inoki vs. Great Muta, Sting did a running over the top rope dive. Rude caught Sting, but the way the ringside area was structured had a board elevated maybe a foot or so above the ground, surrounding the ringside area. In going down catching Sting, Rude's back landed half on the board, breaking when the top half had nowhere to evenly break the fall, blowing out the C4 and C5 vertebrae. Rude blamed Sting for being careless in where he dove, and there was tremendous heat between the two, which some feared could turn into a problem when Rude returned in late 1997 that had intensified due to things said during depositions in Rude's later lawsuit against WCW over the incident. Rude got up and won the title with a pile driver and a knee drop off the top rope after distraction from valet Lady Love, who worked his corner in those days only on Japan tours. Rude never wrestled again, and it was a few weeks after the fact announced later the title change was rescinded and given back to Sting due to the controversy surrounding the finish. Rude, injured, was, in very bitter fashion, gone from WCW. He was 35 years old and in the second year of the biggest contract he ever signed, his wife said. And then it basically ended. That just killed him. He was a great entertainer, and it really hurt him that he couldn't perform. Even at the risk of injuring himself seriously, he'd have tried it again. Aside from testifying in the McMahon trial, Rude was out of wrestling for the next 3 years and living in Tampa. There were constant rumors he would return, most of the time to the WWF, but he had made out huge on a settlement from Lloyd's and had a lawsuit ongoing against WCW due to the career-ending injury, and returning to the ring would kill both. Eventually he returned to ECW in 1997 in the role of a television announcer who was there to screw with Shane Douglas, until turning on Tommy Dreamer. At about the same time, WWF hired him to work television tapings as an insurance policy with Shawn Michaels and Hunter Hearst Helmsley in the original incarnation of DX, before he stunned both groups that he was working for simultaneously without a contract, by signing with WCW, since both groups thought that wasn't even an option because of his hatred for the company and the lawsuit. As part of his deal, he dropped his lawsuit. And the WWF did attempt to bury him on the way out, having Downtown Bruno dress up in a suit like Rude to give the impression that literally anyone could have filled his position. Rude's rough exterior camouflaged the person who talked at length to other wrestlers about his 3 children, Little Rick, 8, Marissa, and Colton, who is 21 months old. He loved to hunt and fish, particularly with Hennig and Rick Steiner. Friends like Sharky, or Bret Hart, noted in his passing that he's one person you'd want to have most as backup in a tough situation because you wouldn't have to worry if he'd be there for you. When an athlete, particularly one well known for being heavily into steroids, passes away, particularly from heart complications, the discussion of steroids always comes into place. In Rude's case, the fact he was 210 pounds off steroids, and while cut, was very thin by the standards of wrestling at that weight, and was quite a bit larger during most of his career, particularly his WWF days having to work next to Warrior, and his WCW heyday in 1993 when he appeared to feel he needed a bigger physique to compensate for not being able to work at his previous level. This led to, among other things, what later became a relatively famous conversation with Vince McMahon during one of his programs with Warrior when he wasn't using steroids, which led to Rude being a reluctant witness against McMahon in his 1994 steroid trial. The problem with this subject is that virtually every wrestler from that era used steroids. Most used many other drugs. Quite possibly some a lot more dangerous. The deaths are from heart attacks of young athletic men, whether it be Louis Spicolli, Brian Pillman, Larry Cameron, Art Barr, Eddie Gilbert, or whomever else we're talking about. All of the above used steroids, but that doesn't necessarily make them a factor or the major factor if they are a small factor in their deaths. It would be safe to say that just about every wrestler from this era that dies young will have used them. Are steroids the culprit? Probably not in all cases, and probably in some. Steroids rarely lead to an odd type of death, although if someone is on a heavy cycle, his blood pressure would be raised and it would make someone far more susceptible while on a cycle to have a heart problem. So would many other drugs. Friends said Rude had been heavily into parabolan and primobolan. At one time last year it was widely rumored he had testicular cancer, which wasn't the case, but he did have a recurring medical problem due to complications in that area from a steroid shot taken in the early 90s while on a WCW tour of England, and had also suffered from phlebitis. In early 1992, when Kip Frey was running WCW, he made tackling the problem of steroid abuse in his company as one of his top priorities, although before he could get a program seriously off the ground, he was replaced at the company's helm by Bill Watts, who took the approach of not caring. Frey brought doctors in to speak to the wrestlers, and it is remembered how Rude, who had a reputation among the wrestlers as a stand-up guy, and the doctor argued vehemently enough to have caused a major scene at one of the meetings when the doctor was trying to persuade wrestlers to stop using steroids because of their dangers. In the 1994 trial of Vince McMahon and Titan Sports on charges related to steroid distribution, which ended up with McMahon acquitted on charges of conspiring to distribute steroids to his wrestlers, Rude was brought in as a very reluctant government witness. Rude testified that he had used steroids before working for the WWF, while working for the WWF, and after leaving the WWF. When asked how prevalent steroid use was in the WWF, he said he imagined that a lot of people were on them. He said he never got steroids from Drive. George Zaurian, the doctor noted as the leading WWF steroid connection in the 80s. He said that on September 22, 1988 that he and his wife wanted to start a family. He said steroids cut down his testosterone levels, so he got off steroids. He said he had a conversation with McMahon, who said he felt he didn't look so good. He claimed that McMahon told him he was happy with his wrestling and his interviews but disappointed in the way he looked. Rude said he told McMahon he hadn't been partying, but that the schedule was demanding. He said he and his wife wanted to have kids, so he wasn't on anything. When prosecuting attorney Sean O'Shea asked him if McMahon told him to get on steroids, Rude said, "Not in those words." When O'Shea asked what he did say, Rude said McMahon told him that when you're down and sore is when you need to push yourself. Rude testified that McMahon may have suggested getting on steroids and may have used the words gas or juice. On cross-examination from McMahon's attorney, Jerry McDevitt, Rude said McMahon never used the word steroids in the conversation. Rude indicated he believed McMahon meant steroids, but when questioned by McDevitt if he was sure that is what McMahon meant, Rude said he wasn't sure. Upon cross-examination from McMahon's other attorney, Laura Brevetti, it was established that Rude continued to use steroids, and not for medical purposes, that he was prescribed by a doctor in England, since by this time steroids were illegal to be prescribed in the United States for anything other than the treatment of a disease, and brought them to the United States. There were probably some people who believed that the death of Pillman some 18 months back would force changes in the profession. Maybe one or two people even felt that after Spicoli died, as his sister noted on television, she wished it would at least save one life, so at least she could feel he didn't die in vain. Seriously, I think people who were hoping that perhaps some good at least for the profession, because the families of these individuals have been given a lifetime sentence that is irrevocable, could possibly be learned. But few have the belief after this that anything will change except the number of the body count. The assembly line will churn out new talent. The promoters will try and make their PR statements about not being policemen and the public not caring. The public won't care. 10 bell salutes at house shows and graphics at the beginning of television shows are on the verge of becoming like the national anthem at the baseball games, a routine occurrence signaling the beginning of the show, a meaning and sadness of which has long been forgotten, and maybe at times, done more for political purposes as a way to avoid actually addressing the issues on television but claiming to not ignore the subject publicly, than anything else. I guess the only thing that many performers within the profession have come to grips with is that this is in many cases a drug sport. Maybe, for a number of reasons, at this point in time, it has to be. Even if it doesn't have to be, there is a reality as to what it is. Certainly it will remain that without huge and widespread changes, and unlike amateur wrestling when it had its problems last year, there is no indication changes will happen or are even seriously being thought about. The pressure of drawing ratings every week occupies so much time that little time is left over for studying what can be done to stop a troubling epidemic, and thus, nothing is done. Men, women, are basically forced to look a certain way, or the public generally won't accept them as great stars unless they are born with freakish size or have an incredible amount of talent and luck to overcome looking natural. Ways that nobody, including people born with exceptional genetics like Richard Rude, can look while living that lifestyle on that schedule without help. They are asked to do things in the ring that a human body simply is not designed to do, at least not for a lengthy period of time, and keep going and not stop. It's a profession where, except in the most extreme of cases, you can't survive at the top unless you learn how to, or get outside help, in ignoring pain. The rewards, both financial and otherwise, are great for making it to the top, greater than at any other time in history. Not all wrestlers that use pain-killing drugs have a serious drug problem. Use is not the problem. It's when the use crosses over to abuse when the problems begin. But even those who make it to the brass ring are often trapped on a career-long treadmill, knowing that the minute they cease to be abnormal, they'll get thrown off. Few can voluntarily walk away. In real life, for better or worse, you'll find very few people who can willingly walk away from fame. It's a more powerful drug than the cocaine or the steroids. So they ride it until they get thrown, And the luckiest ones are the ones who can live out their lives without too much pain and with a healthy bank account. The unlucky ones are doomed to a second lifetime of pain in a profession where most but the most loyal fans forget you 2 weeks after you're off the treadmill. But the most unlucky of all are the families of those who don't get that second lifetime. Whether this business can change may be a question that is immaterial. It won't change until it's forced to change. At least not change based on all the warning signals. The measures it will take by promoters to clean it up aren't going to be done with any quick fix. It'll require a ton of examination of the problem. And none of that is going to be done. Drug testing has been gone through and debated a million times. The tests aren't that hard to beat. And even when athletes do fail, you'd have to rely on the honesty of those who get the results to administer the consequences. If you pay attention, you know athletes are smart enough to talk their way out of positive results many times anyway. So the system doesn't really work that well in the sports that it is done in. I seriously doubt results of tests are reported honestly without compromises and cover-ups in major college and pro sports, and pro wrestling is on the lowest end of the ethics food chain to begin with. But even so, as is seemingly written in these pages now on almost a weekly basis, there is a major difference. People just simply don't die in those sports, or entertainment forms at anywhere close to the rate they do in this one. They don't even die at this rate in boxing. Whatever fingers can be pointed at the NFL or college football for having painkiller and steroid problems, we aren't seeing 15 to 17 guys drop dead every year in the pros and more than 100 in the college game, which would be the statistical equivalence of what is going on in wrestling. Until those within wrestling acknowledge that reality rather than run from it and proclaim it as unfair when these numbers are brought out, nothing is going to change. You can talk about making the schedule easier, and that sounds good on the surface and maybe it would help, but the fact is the schedule for Major League wrestlers today is probably the easiest it has been in the last 15 or 20 years and the problems still exist, probably on a greater basis than ever. You can't say Rude's work schedule was that difficult at the time of his death. Or Spicoli's. Certainly not by the standards of this business during a time period when people didn't die with nearly this frequency. Rude's death was covered as a major story every half hour on rotation on the ESPN News channel along with regularly repeating the segment on deaths of wrestlers concentrating on Brian Pillman, with an eerie scene of Rude at the 10-bell salute on Raw for Pillman, from the Outside the Line show, as well as the same segment airing all day as the cover story on SportsCenter. CNN and Headline News also covered it. It garnered a lot of media play in the Atlanta market, and the newspapers in the Twin Cities also ran stories on his death, but there was little other national coverage. Both Tokyo Sports and Nikkei Sports in Japan ran stories on the death with steroids speculated as a possible cause. The latter piece also tied in recent health problems of wrestlers like Dynamite Kid and Davey Boy Smith, who were huge stars in Japan. Aside from obits in the Atlanta and Minneapolis media, it didn't receive much other national coverage. Rick Rude Career Title History. Source: Wrestling Title Histories 3rd edition. World Championship Wrestling International World Heavyweight, defeated Ric Flair September 19, 1993 Houston. Lost to Hiroshi March 16, 1994 Tokyo, defeated Hiroshi March 24, 1994. Kyoto lost to Sting April 17, 1994 Chicago. Defeated Sting May 1, 1994 Fukuoka. Rude quit promotion and vacated title due to suffering a broken back in Fukuoka Dome match, so title change was reversed. World Wrestling Federation Intercontinental Heavyweight, defeated Ultimate Warrior April 2, 1989 Atlantic City, New Jersey. Lost to Ultimate Warrior August 28, 1989 East Rutherford, New Jersey. National Wrestling Alliance World Tag Team, with Manny Fernandez defeated Ricky Morton and Robert Gibson December 6, 1986 Atlanta. Title vacated when Rude jumped to World Wrestling Federation May 1987. World Championship Wrestling United States Heavyweight, defeated Sting November 19, 1991 Savannah, Georgia. Vacated title December 1992 due to suffering neck injury. World Class Wrestling Association World Heavyweight named first champion February 1986 when American Heavyweight title became World Heavyweight title when World Class Promotion left the NWA. Lost to Chris Adams July 4, 1986 Dallas. World Class American Heavyweight, defeated King Parsons. November 4, 1985 Fort Worth. Title was renamed WCWA World Heavyweight title February 1986. World Class Television title, defeated Lance Von Erich May 5, 1986 Fort Worth. Lost to Bruiser Brody May 17, 1986 Fort Worth. NWA Southern Heavyweight Florida version, Defeated Pez Whatley January 16, 1985 Tampa. Lost to Brian Blair April 10, 1985 Tampa. Defeated Mike Graham in tournament final to win vacant title July 21, 1985 Orlando. Lost to Wahoo McDaniel October 2, 1985 Tampa. NWA United States Tag Team Florida version, with Jesse Barr defeated Mark and Jay Youngblood April 16, 1985 Tampa. Lost to Wahoo McDaniel and Billy Jack Haynes July 9, 1985 Tampa. Southern Heavyweight Tennessee version, defeated Jerry Lawler June 11, 1984 Memphis. Lost to Tommy Rich July 22, 1984 Memphis. Southern Tag Team, with King Kong Bundy defeated Stan Lane and Steve Kieran in tournament final October 8, 1984 Memphis to win vacant title. Lost to Stan Lane and Steve Kieran October 22, 1984 Memphis. Wrestling Observer Awards. 1992 Best Heel. 1992 Worst Match of the Year vs. Masahiro Chono October 25, Philadelphia. In last week's story on the life of Rick Rude, there was one more very important story regarding his initial departure from WCW that was more than just simply the back injury from the match at the Fukuoka Dome. Before the Japan match, there were numerous problems brewing between Rude and WCW to the point that many were very skeptical at the time, due to the timing of it, as to the legitimacy of Rude's back injury. In the weeks leading up to the match, Rude had asked WCW to buy him out of his contract, which paid $315,000 per year, similar as they had done when dumping several contracts at around the same period of time, paying guys a figure of about 60% or 70% of what was left on their contract to simply go home, and in exchange the wrestler wouldn't work for opposition groups. So Rude, who had been bothered by neck and back injuries already, was attempting to negotiate his way out of the company and into either a retirement or a lengthy hiatus, literally days before suffering the career-ending back injury in Japan. In addition, to attempt to pressure WCW to acquiesce to his wishes, he also stated that he wouldn't put Ric Flair, Vader or Hulk Hogan, who was to start with the company 6 weeks later, who along with Sting were the biggest stars in the company at the time, over for various different reasons. In the days when wrestling big show main events were actually planned out months in advance, the plan at that time was for Hogan to debut on July 17, 1994 at Bash at the Beach in Daytona Beach, Florida, and either do a tag team match with Flair, a babyface at the time, teaming with him against Rude and Curt Hennig, who WCW was attempting to lure out of retirement at the time, or if Hennig fell through, as it did, to Hogan and Sting versus Flair, who would turn heel to start a program with Sting and Hogan teaming with Rude. In both scenarios, Rude was the one who was going to drop the fall to Hogan, and Rude still had heat with Hogan from the WWF days because Rude, due to the size difference, never got a big money program with Hogan, even though he was a better heel than the majority of those Hogan worked with during that period. With Rude out of the picture, the plans were changed, with Flair unifying both titles by beating Sting and using Sherry Martel as his manager, turning heel once again in the process, leading to them going right to Flair Hogan in Daytona Beach and Hogan winning the title in his first match with the company. WCW at the same time was unhappy with the quality of Rude's matches because his work had declined largely due to his injuries. Nevertheless, even with the two sides at a major contract dispute, WCW went on with its plans as usual, as silly as it sounds now, and it sounded just as silly at the time, and had Rude, despite him threatening to leave and not do jobs, go over for the WCW International title over Sting in the Fukuoka Dome match. In the weeks before a May 22nd PPV match where Rude, having won the title, but having missed all his scheduled WCW house shows after that point due to the injury, it wasn't clear if Rude would come to Philadelphia for that show. As it turned out, this was the only PPV show Rude ever was scheduled to main event in WCW on his own. He also was part of a War Games main event, which drew a disastrous 3,600, paying $53,000 to the Civic Center and in 0.48 buy rate in a match where he was scheduled to defend against Vader while Flair would defend the NWA title against Barry Windham. Originally, that was set to be a double countout finish which would lead to a Rude vs. Sting return 1 month later. The feeling was going into that match that there were 3 possibilities. At the time, Rude wouldn't show up in Philadelphia, and they would announce the Fukuoka Dome result had been reversed and Sting was still champion since Rude came off the top ropes, illegal at the time under WCW rules, although it was in New Japan where it was legal, or because of outside interference of Lady Love, which isn't exactly what happened but was the closest to what happened. Rude would show up for a final match and drop the title in the ring to Vader, or everything would get worked out and Rude and Vader would do the double countout with Rude retaining the title. At least 1 week before the show, it was clear that Rude wasn't going to be able to wrestle on the show. However, that didn't keep WCW from still advertising the match as the PPV main event. As it turned out, Rude showed up in Philadelphia saying he wanted to fulfill his contractual obligations, and while not being able to wrestle, or as it turned out, even appearing on the show, was actually the biggest story on the show. Rude was supposed to do something where he'd do an angle or wind up giving the title up and Sting would face Vader for the title on the show. Rude refused to do it, and it got seriously heated between Rude and Flair, the booker at the time, before Rude walked out of the building just before the live show started. This left poor Nick Bockwinkel, serving as WCW's commissioner, to be the fool in front of the cameras. Before the first match, Bockwinkel came out and announced that the International Board of Directors had nullified the title change in Japan because Rude used the title belt as a weapon and because he came off the top rope with a knee drop for the finish, and that Rude wasn't going to be wrestling on the show. Fans booed and chanted rip-off when it was announced Sting would get the belt back, even though Sting was the face. Sting then refused to accept the belt unless he could win it in the ring against Vader, which only slightly quelled the audience. Rude sued WCW for the remaining $630,000, settled out of court when Eric Bischoff signed Rude to his 3-year contract in November 1997 on his contract and collected Lloyd's of London disability. The WWF did a tremendous tribute video to Rude, with comments from both Vince McMahon and Terry Taylor, on the May 2nd Superstars show. There have been numerous reports stemming from the WCW hotline, which is often the place to get the least reliable information on WCW, which we've been unable to confirm, that WCW would continue to pay the family of Rude for the remaining 2 years on his contract. For whatever this is worth, the company didn't do the same for Louis Spicolli, although he didn't have a wife and 3 young children. WWF paid Brian Pillman's family on his contract for 3 more months after his death, and also cooperated in numerous fundraising activities for the family, including allowing talent to participate in memorial shows last year and this year. A correction from last week regarding GHB and ecstasy. They are 2 different drugs. GHB is more popular with a lot of the older wrestlers, and ecstasy, which comes in pill form, is the big nightclub drug and more popular with the younger crowd. Whether it's the clash of titans in the ring or the drama that unfolds outside it, we're here to break it down, match by match, feud by feud. Remember, in the world of wrestling, every day is a battle, and every victory is a story waiting to be told. Until next time, keep the passion alive, and never stop wrestling with the possibilities. This is the Pro Wrestle Machine,